Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now there are a few ways to think of the Nvidia GTX 1630, either as a GT 1030 successor, a modern replacement for the 1050 Ti, or a cut down GTX 1650. One of the main comments I get whenever I test it is, oh, this thing actually exists. Now we've tested it before a few times, but I wanted to run a few of the latest games on it just to see how it's holding up, because it was never a fantastic card to begin with. I want to test this thing quarterly with new game releases because it is starting to appear more on the used market, and you might want to know if one of these is worth it if the price is cheap enough. Now this was quite a poorly reviewed card. I myself looked at one when it first launched. It's good for some esports online competitive shooters if you turn the settings down low enough, of course, but when it comes to AAA games it is going to struggle unless you make some hefty sacrifices. So the games I've tested today are all from 2024 or newer. We'll start with Microsoft Flight Simulator at 1080p with the lowest settings. Now for this one I had to enable FSR2 and set it to ultra performance. This gave us an average of 34 frames per second above London, though some areas will differ. And wherever you are in the world, that will depend, of course, on how many frames per second you get, not to mention the weather and many other factors too. Above London, with clear skies, we're seeing 34 FPS with a 1% low of 24 and a 0.1% low of 20. It's fair to say we have to make some hefty graphical sacrifices in order to hit at least 30 FPS. The same can be said for Stalker 2, and we've had to make as equally, if not more, of a significant sacrifice to the visuals. I'm using the lowest settings with TSR because it looks a little better and it doesn't cost us too much in terms of performance. This is set to performance mode with 29% scale. 25% is the minimum according to the menu, but I couldn't actually set 25%. It kept reverting to 29% for whatever reason, but this was just about enough for us to scrape by with 30 and a half almost frames per second. The percentile lows do leave a little bit to be desired, and overall visually it isn't the sharpest looking game in the world, which I think is fair to say. There's a lot of artifacting, stuff like that, but this is a sacrifice we need to make. Even if we drop the native res to say 720 or 900p, it's probably not going to be enough. Well, I know it's not really enough, actually, after having tested this game for a good half an hour. Moving on to Call of Duty Black Ops 6. Now, this is an online first-person competitive shooter. You know, you're going to want as many frames as possible, and that will come at the cost of visuals. But I don't think we've had to make too much of a sacrifice. We have the lowest settings as always here. I've actually gone with Nvidia image scaling, which provided slightly sharper visuals than FSR1, and I've set this to performance mode. Now surprisingly we actually got 81 frames per second. This is an average taken across a few maps, so this was pretty surprising actually. Our 1% low was 60 and our 0.1% low was 55, so not really much in the way of stutter either. This is probably helped a bit by the i7-12700F that we're using in our system, along with 32 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4. So the rest of the system is certainly carrying this little card. I've seen this at about 60 quid at CEX here in the UK, the 1630. At that price, you're probably going to want to consider something like an RX 580 instead. Maybe a GTX 1650, because that's probably not going to cost you much more. It might even be cheaper. With that, let's move on to our next game, Black Myth Wukong. Now at 1080p with the lowest TSR, this time with 50% scale, we actually saw 44 frames per second. Now, with this one, I did have 30 plus FPS in mind. If we saw 30 frames per second without too much of a visual sacrifice, then I would have been happy. So 44 is definitely more than I could have asked for. Interestingly, if we increase this even just to 60% scale, then our frame rate will drop below 30. So I think this is probably a VRAM issue here. Let's not forget we're also working with just 4 gigs of this stuff. And what is a 64-bit card? This has a 64-bit memory bus as well. So cut down across the board really. 44 frames per second though wasn't as bad as I imagined, with a 1% low of 35 and a 0.1% low of 26. So even those percentile lows, well, all I can really say is that they weren't as bad as I thought they were going to be. For Spider-Man 2 at 1080p, again with, you guessed it, the lowest settings, we went with FSR 3.1.0 performance mode here for an average of 43 frames per second. Now we could try and target 60 FPS, and on some occasions we will see it if we drop the upscaling preset even lower to ultra performance, perhaps switch to ITGI. The game is going to look worse, and again this isn't going to guarantee a constant 60 frames per second. We still saw plus 60 every so often, but most of the time you're going to see between 35 and 55. The percentile lows are also a bit, well, poor, 19 and 17 respectively, and the city really does take a toll on this little GPU. But again, I think in terms of that average, probably better than I anticipated. As I said at the start, I want to keep up with this card quarterly just to see how it handles 2025, because I have a feeling there are going to be some pretty heavy hitters, more so than what we've seen in this video so far. Red Dead Redemption 2 is out of the question because it is slightly older, but Red Dead Redemption 1 released on PC in 2024, only about 14 years after it came to Xbox 360 and PS3, and of course we are able to get at least 60 frames per second. The game actually runs really nicely on the 1630 with the high preset and FXAA. If we leave native AA and FSR3 enabled, we do see drops below 60, so switching to FXAA is your best bet. And here we saw 70 plus frames per second overall, even in and around the town. I almost said Valentine, but that's Red Dead Redemption 2. Armadillo is where we're at here. Marvel Rivals at 1080p, lowest of course, FSR Ultra Performance for plus 60 frames per second. I feel as though plus 60 is important for this one, again because it's an online game. We actually saw 65 with a 1% low of 42 and a 0.1% low of 24, so wasn't too bad overall, especially considering what I've come to expect from the 1630. It's not what I would call a good card, it's not what most people would call a good card at all, but as I say, it's interesting to follow its progress through 2025 to see how it holds up, and if it becomes really cheap, then it may be an option for some of you wanting to play some pretty easygoing titles. I don't think it's quite cheap enough yet though, with other used options at similar money on the market. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 then to finalise, one of my favourites. It's earned that title even in the week or so that it's been out. 1080p, low settings. I say 1080p, but it's not really because we've had to implement upscaling with basically every result so far. But we're using FSR balanced mode here to provide a nice, well, balance between visuals and gameplay. 43 frames per second. I think this is acceptable given the circumstances. The 1 and 0.1% lows were also pretty decent, 36 and 34. This is regarded as a well-optimised title, and that's something I found as well in my testing. It runs really well on a wide range of hardware, and it's nice to see a plus 30 or plus 40 FPS average even on the 4GB GTX 1630 here. So that's all for this one, really. We're going to probably visit this card a few more times throughout the year as new significant releases come out. There are some big games coming out over the course of the next 10 or so months, so it'll be interesting to see how this thing handles those. Hopefully you can join me for the next instalment of the GTX 1630 versus the world of PC gaming, but as for this one, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.